Reasonable, 20, even 10 years ago is not reasonable now, and the problem you're getting is that the ambit and the width of defendants is growing larger. Referees are now in, sporting bodies, selection bodies will be in fairly shortly, disciplinary bodies will be in at some point, and it depends where you draw the line.
Well, what can be done then, Charles Woodhouse? Because clearly you're in a situation where if people bring in all these waivers all over the place, then genuine injuries for which negligence perhaps is responsible won't be able to be paid for in the courts.
I don't think this waiver will deal with serious injuries where there's clearly negligence. Nothing can oust the jurisdiction of the courts, and that were there to be a major claim of that sort. But in a disciplinary matter where someone's reputation, livelihood, remember the problems of Barcelona when 2 weightlifters were sent home, this serious problem, legal problems arose, and this time I think everyone's tried to get their act together, and these sort of claims may not happen.
Brian Moore, Charles Woodhouse, thank you both very much indeed. Just a quick look at the papers. The Times leads tomorrow on the IRA blitz on gas and water plants foiled. The Guardian, again, the police claim IRA bomb coup there. Telegraph also on the IRA bombing campaign, the police foiling it. Major in mental health rethink. He wants, apparently, it's reported a rethink on mental health asylums. Financial Times, Labour hits of Tories over Ulster crisis. And the Express on the IRA, the Mail also on the IRA, and the Sun, jealous woman wrecked my love, says Jill Faldo, apparently. That's all from Newsnight tonight. Jeremy Paxman will be back with more tomorrow night. Until then, from all of us on the programme, very good night.
Tonight, Sir Bernard Ingham and guests consider whether a private education should be more widely available to less privileged families. The Midnight Hour in 45 minutes.
The 125th British Open at Royal Lytham and St Anne's. Over 150 contenders, professional and amateur, and any one of them can achieve glory in the world's greatest golfing tournament. The Open. Live coverage begins Thursday at 10:25 on BBC2 and from 1:15 on Radio 5 Live.
This Wednesday, BBC2 invites you on a night out with the lads. But mind you don't spill your drink, fail to keep up, or stand out from the crowd. If you want to be sure of staying alive, BBC2's To Dance season continues with the award-winning, uncompromising Enter Achilles by DV8, Wednesday at 9:40.
Now on BBC2, the first of 2 classic concerts being shown as a tribute to the legendary Ella Fitzgerald, who died last month.
Tomorrow night, BBC2 invites you out with the lads. But mind you don't spill your drink, fail to keep up, or stand out from the crowd. If you want to be sure of staying alive, BBC2's To Dance season continues with the award-winning, uncompromising Enter Achilles by DV8, tomorrow at 9:40.
No one in the world has triple jumped further than Jonathan Edwards. With Olympic gold in sight, what gives the Sports Personality of the Year his winning edge? The devout Christian says it's a matter of faith.
Part of that is to be the best athlete I can be.
Jonathan Edwards, Leap of Faith, tomorrow at 9, BBC2.
Back to tonight and look at the weather view now on BBC2 with Michael Fish.
Hello there. Quiet settle weather, I think, for the foreseeable future around the British Isles. Something of a mini heat wave. Temperatures well up into the 20s. Now, there's nothing quiet or settled about the weather to the south of Japan. Just the opposite. That's actually a super typhoon, and it's been moving northwards during the course of the last 24 hours or so, heading somewhere close to that southwestern tip there of Japan. And it's a pretty potent storm indeed, with winds up to 280 kilometres an hour. That's well over 150 miles an hour, so something obviously to keep an eye on. But by complete contrast, rather than an intense area of low pressure, we have an intense area of high pressure. And that's going to be around for some considerable time, keeping the weather fine and settled. So intense that at Heathrow, we've just seen the highest July pressure on record, 30.6 inches if you want to set your barometer. Main thing though, in the next few days, it's going to get warmer and warmer just about everywhere. And by the end of the week, at least in southern and central parts, it looks as if it's going to be pretty hot as I said a while ago. Now, interestingly, earlier on we had quite a lot of cloud across eastern parts of England, but that, as the sun got to work on it, very soon dispersed, and it's been clear blue skies really for much of the time. A little bit of patchy cloud has floated into Ireland during the course of the evening, still around for the rest of the night, and one or two little bits and pieces of cloud in northern Scotland, perhaps sufficient to give a spot of drizzle in Shetland, and again some cloud feeding in across that south-eastern corner of the country. That, with the breeze, will hold the temperatures up there, but a pretty chilly night to come further north, lowest 6 or 7 degrees. So if we do start off with some cloud in the southeast, it's going to break up, burn off a bit more readily than it did probably today. And so some cloud perhaps from time to time in that northern part of Scotland, but that too breaking to give some sunny intervals. Still that northeasterly wind around, not as strong as it was, but nevertheless it's going to be fairly noticeable across the south of the country. It'll be good in the way that if you're along that eastern coast, it'll keep the pollen counts right down, but in central and eastern parts, central and western parts, I mean, so it is going to be a pretty nasty day for hay fever sufferers. Again, those winds and sea breezes in other parts holding the temperatures in coastal areas around about 17 or 18 degrees, but a little bit warmer than it was today, 23 degrees for instance, around the Bristol area, and do take care because that sun's pretty hot. And that sun's going to be pretty hot in the next few days as well. We keep these sort of welcome sea breezes around most of the coast, tempering the heat there, but we will find that in other parts, maybe just a little bit of mistiness to begin with. Otherwise, the day should be dry with virtually unbroken sunshine. Still some cloud in the far northwestern corner there of Scotland. And if anything, that may well get a little bit thicker as we head towards the weekend. By that time, giving one or two spits and spots of light rain and drizzle. But in other parts of the country, nothing changes at all. The sea breezes hold on, the sunshine holds on. The only thing that's going to be different, if anything, is that the temperatures continue to creep up. So that eventually we get to about 28 degrees, that's 82 Fahrenheit. A very good night to you.
The Good Food Guide to the Highlands, with convenience fungi, pre-packed preserves,
Sticky business, this. Sticky business. It really is, yeah.
and a truly free range. Savour the best Scottish produce in Wild Harvest with Nick Nairn tomorrow at 8:30 on BBC2.
Today, William Morris is the darling of the middle classes. His wallpaper sells for hundreds of pounds a roll. But once, he was a revolutionary.
This man didn't believe there should be any government at all, didn't believe in there should be marriage or law, or there shouldn't be prisons.
People have tried to turn him into a woolly-minded liberal, and yet Morris was dangerous.
The man behind the wallpaper. BBC2 celebrates William Morris's centenary, Sunday at 7:30 on BBC2.
Now on BBC2, Leslie Riddick is in the chair for the Midnight Hour.
And welcome to the Midnight Hour on a most confusing night for war watchers. Michael Portillo, at last year's Tory conference, pledged to fight on the beaches, the floor of the European Court and almost anywhere else to keep the British Army distinctively British. And yet tonight in the Commons, the Defence Secretary stood accused of betraying the armed forces, slashing the defence budget, and had to make concessions to force through the sale of MOD married quarters. In fact, under the Tories, defence spending has fallen by a third since the end of the Cold War. Michael Foot and old Labour would have been delighted. But New Labour, of course, is a different kettle of fish. Tony Blair doesn't want a European army, doesn't want to scrap Trident immediately, doesn't even mention Labour's old policy of coaxing Britain's arms manufacturers to diversify. The two main political parties seem to have picked up one another's scripts. But the real questions still remain. Could Britain mount another Gulf or Falklands campaign single-handedly? Should we even aspire to it? Can Britain supply enough troops to cope with what might develop in Northern Ireland? Here to answer questions and fire off a few of their own are Sir Geoffrey Patty, Defence Minister under Mrs Thatcher, non-executive chairman of GEC Marconi and Conservative MP for Chertsey and Walton. Bruce George is Labour MP for Walsall South and Vice Chairman of the Commons Defence Select Committee. Susan Willett is a defence economist at King's College London, and Colonel Terry Taylor is Assistant Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and he's a long-serving Army officer. So a quick question to start, and first to you, Bruce. Have the defence cuts gone too far?
Yes. When Geoffrey was Defence Minister, expenditure was probably 5% or more of GDP. Now it's about 2.9, going down to 2.7, and frankly, the government cannot run a defence policy as though it was spending 5% of GDP when in fact they're spending half of that. So I say yes, it's gone too far. They should be reversed, not enormously, but should be reversed.
Terry?
Well, I think they've gone too far too. I think particularly from the manpower point of view and the personnel to carry out all the missions that they're faced with at the moment, clearly there is overstretch. So it seems to me that their forces have been cut too much.
Geoffrey, you won't agree with that?
Well, obviously I wouldn't agree, because I don't think we've gone too far. I think we've tried to get a balance, which is difficult to achieve when there are tough budgets. But I think really that I'd like to pray and aid Professor or the President of France, Jacques Chirac.
Well, this is most surprising from a Conservative.
I thought actually in this case he's not a bad person to have on one side. When he said, very surprisingly, that he would like to see the French armed forces achieve the standards that the British armed forces have. And I think really that quality is what we're after. We've had to reduce, of course, and I think it's been right to do so, but we've got good quality.
Sue?
Well, I think there's still room for further cuts. We are at 2.9% of GDP now. The European average is around 2% of GDP. I think in the post-Cold War security environment, it is pertinent that we rethink much more profoundly than has so far taken place our actual defence roles and missions.
Well, that, apart from anything else, seems to be a direct challenge to you, Bruce. I mean, here you are. You've got a completely different point of view. That's too little to be spending.
If we were engaged in a full-scale war, and nothing is impossible, then Ms Willett would be rather concerned and be very critical of what governments have done for not spending enough. You cannot be certain how the international situation is going to evolve, and in a future war we might have to fight at a very high-tech level or at a very simple level. And frankly, what the government has done by reducing to 2.7% is to do so in a very haphazard way. If there was a strategic rationale behind substantial reductions, then maybe a case could be made. But it's all been Treasury driven. It's proceeded in a downward slope in fits and starts, and what has emerged, I'm afraid, are armed forces that are very competent, as Geoffrey said, as individuals, but in terms of the equipment that is supplied to it, including by Geoffrey's company, I'm afraid we are not up to the tasks that the government may be forced to ask our soldiers to perform.
Bruce, can I just actually challenge you about that? Because where do you see this threat coming from, in which we would be likely, single-handedly, to be engaged in a war, in a major high-technology, high-intensity war? At present, the only scenario in which we are likely to be engaged in a high-technology war is in a multilateral situation with our allies.
But if you read your own literature from King's College, you will see it's a very dangerous world we're living in. Proliferation is proceeding. Regional conflicts could escalate. If Yeltsin dies, who will come?
I would challenge you that in terms of our own territory,
in our own territory,
we actually are safer now than we have ever been in this century.
But you have to that's a very good vindication of Conservative defence policy.
I would agree with that.
You're really desperate. You won't be desperate.
No, I just thought it was a rather good indication. If we're safer now than we have been. I mean,
I would directly challenge, ever so briefly, I will say that the Treasury enforced on the government in the late 20s a 12-year rule. There won't be any wars in 12 years. And the result was we were totally unprepared, under, I might add, Jeffrey's government, for what was the Second World War. You cannot predict what is going to happen, and as you cannot predict, it is essential, therefore, you have a wide range of capabilities which will permit you to deploy your forces in any scenario that emerges. Intelligence has failed us repeatedly. You simply don't know how dangerous the world is going to be.
But Bruce, you do accept, don't you, that we are, on current expectations and forecasts, most likely to be operating in coalition with our allies, either within NATO or in UN resolutions and NATO-backed operations anywhere in the world, surely.
But when your allies are spending even less than you are, I'm afraid reliance upon them is a rather dangerous activity.
Terry, who should we be frightened of?
Well, the threats are, I think, pretty clear, although one has to be ready for the unexpected. And clearly, the Gulf is a classic example. A threat of that proportion is likely to arise again. I think any government would be irresponsible in planning for that not happening again. Of course we'll be operating in those sort of operations with allies. We couldn't carry out an operation like that on our own. That is perfectly clear. But what is also perfectly clear with what we're doing now, if you remember, we've just sent 1,000 extra troops to Northern Ireland, for example, and several months ago we wouldn't have expected to be doing that. And it's perfectly clear from the personnel point of view that we're overstretched. I mean, if there was another major crisis now, like in the Middle East, for example, where Saddam Hussein threatened over a quarter of the world's oil supplies, that's a British national interest. It's not just a threat to the home country, and this is where I take issue with you, Sue. We have interests all over the world. So has Europe. We need to make a major contribution to that.
But we went to the Gulf. I mean, you accept, and you're not saying, are you, that we couldn't do the Gulf again today?
I think we are in serious danger of being overstretched. We've just sent 1,000 to Northern Ireland,
yes,
right?
You said.
So we got a major operation in Bosnia. If Bosnia went bad and we got something in the Middle East, that difficult decisions will have to be made.
But of course, but I mean I mean, with respect, that applies to every single one of the NATO allies. I mean, the Americans have actually done a reassessment of their defence posture, saying that they could cope with whatever it is, 2 regional conflicts at the same time, and they're a superpower.
About 1.5.
Well, okay, all right, 1.5, right, fine. Well, you know, whatever that be, I would like to be involved in the half.
Yes, Jeffrey, you mentioned a strategic assessment. I think one of the main things the Labour Party has said, and I now very much support Labour Party defence policy. Now
they brought out with you.
Now we're all New Labour. It's a strategic review. The Americans have done a strategic review. I would have thought that we could get a better match of commitments and resources if there was a serious strategic analysis and a strategic review, which is not like the options for change process, which I'm afraid was rather haphazard and produced rather skewed results. So
but is strategic review another name for a defence review? I mean, let's just have an old lock, stock and barrel defence review. That's what you're going to say, is it?
Yes, I think a defence review, but Labour has said a defence review where there could be an increase in defence expenditure. What we've seen under your government is an inexorable decline in defence expenditure to a level that my former colleague Frank Lawn would have been elated to support.
Everybody's
declined. But not from 5.5 to 2.7.
But we were overspending before. We were way over the average in Europe before. We were one of the few countries that committed ourselves to the 3% increase. So it is quite right.
But you're assuming the others are right in spending less, which
we have brought down our defence expenditure to a level that was compatible with the rise in tensions during the Cold War, because we are not in a situation of bipolar confrontation anymore. The likelihood that we are going to enter into that kind of level of high-intensity warfare is very unlikely.
But
what we're talking about in terms of the Gulf, no, it is not the same as the Cold War. And what I'm trying to say is that if we are going to enter into even Gulf scenarios or into Bosnia type of scenarios, what we actually need to reassess, and I would agree with you, we need a review, but we need a review that reassesses how the cuts are apportioned. And I don't think that has been done effectively under the present Government.
So what mistakes
because
have
I
been made?
think what has happened is there's been too much emphasis on cuts in manpower. And when Terry's talking about overstretch, we're talking about manpower overstretch. What we have in fact done is preserved the great symbols of military power, like the Eurofighter 2000, like the EH-101, like the Challenger tank. The likelihood of those systems actually being used, even in multilateral operations like the Gulf, are highly unlikely.
No, I'm sorry, that's not. That's just
in the Gulf, one required a ground attack, not.
So, but I'm sorry, no, that is really
ground
that's really
attack
nonsense.
aircraft.
But, you know, Bruce, did I hear the sound of a commitment there?
Just a sec, we'll get back to that perhaps.
I thought there was an
I'd like to
expenditure
hear from you,
commitment there.
Terry. That sounds like a kind of accusation, if I probably put it not too well, of boys with toys.
Well, I was very surprised that Sue used the term symbols, and I don't think the Challenger tank or the EH-101 are symbols. I mean, of course they're symbols if you haven't got the proper backup and you haven't got the men to fly them
and the
so on, and they don't operate.
and the logistics
so on. I'm sure you didn't really mean symbols.
Cut.
But where I disagree with you, you're saying we don't need these anymore, is what you were saying. Of course we need them. We may need them in Bosnia. That could be a very major conflict. I mean, the fighting in Bosnia before the present agreement was on a major scale. Major artillery, combat aircraft.
And you're arguing for more of these symbols.
We need all this stuff. This is not a symbol.
No, I'm not arguing for more of these symbols, but at present what we have is a situation, I'm sure you're all familiar with this term, hollow army, because we have these symbols of military might, which we actually can't operationalize effectively because we have cut the supplies, the ammunition, the training time, all the requirements that you need to make these
give us some examples
these types of equipment operational.
Give us some
in
examples.
the Gulf War, I'm sure you are aware of this, Geoffrey, in the Gulf War, we got to a situation where we had almost run out of ammunition for certain weapon systems because the way the cuts had been applied was in all the support systems that was required for because we tried to preserve all the major military procurement
I'll tell you why we had a problem with ammunition, which is simply that in order to hold the requisite amount of stocks for the completely optimum type of we might be involved in a war situation is a very, very large, that is right, that's a very high expenditure level. So one takes a question of saying